Hi there. Welcome to another edition of Talk Stocks. I'm your host, Keir Reynolds. And today we're lucky enough to catch up with Rob McLeod, CEO, President, Director of Cambria Gold Mines, trades on the TSX Venture Exchange with the ticker CAMB. Hey, how you doing today, Rob?
Good to see you, Kier. I'm doing really great. I've got a bunch of found money in my back pocket, and there's no greater feeling.
Well, I really look forward to unpacking that. Found money is great. I'm sure there's probably a very juicy, good story there. But maybe before we kind of, jump too much into that, would you mind just giving sort of the viewers a quick sort of like elevator pitch? What's Cambria Gold? What's it all about?
Yeah, so Cambria Gold Mines is a near-term producer or near-term restart, if you will. It's the former Ascot Resources. We have two projects where we look to utilize a brand new 2,500 ton per day mill that was recently commissioned. On the two properties, there's four deposits. There's about 2 million ounces of measured and indicated resources and 1 million ounces of inferred. And our vision is to use that central mill to be fed by all of these deposits, with the most important being what I believe is the best undeveloped underground gold deposit in Canada, the Red Mountain deposit. Big, wide, high grade, bulk mineable underground system. And so we're targeting a restart of operations anywhere at the soonest in mid 2027, or if we run into typical mining related issues, which you never know, would be in 2028. Tremendous exploration upside, very strong shareholder base, and we've recently assembled the team that's going to get these projects restarted. So, and of course, myself, I have tons of local knowledge, being a born and bred Stewart resident and a geologist that knows those rocks very well.
Yeah, we can't sort of fast forward over that. That's kind of the important part. You've got quite a bit of knowledge, and you previously had sort of sold Red Mountain, a project that you'd taken advanced quite a ways, and I don't think it had really been advanced very much since you sort of sold and combined with a company called Ascot, which was kind of the previous iteration of Cambria. So you've got it back. It's back under your sort of oversight and leadership. And we can get in a little bit about what you're going to do there, but I wanted to ask you before we get too crazy into that, all the Stewart stuff, is you kind of surprised me with some news. I didn't even know that you guys had a big copper porphyry project called Margaret in Washington State in the U.S. Not Stewart, but sounds like some exciting things going on. Maybe that's the found money that you're sort of talking about. Maybe you could kind of unpack that. That was a left field news, but left field in such a positive way. It looks like a massive, huge project.
It is a very special surprise for sure. The predecessor company, Ascot Resources, it went through, like many junior companies do, multiple different iterations and phases in its lifetime. And so there's two non-core assets aside from our gold deposits. There's a rock, sand, and gravel project that's on Tidewater, south of Stewart, fully permitted. And then there's also this copper deposit. And so, we knew it was in the portfolio. I had in my mind that it was around 100 million tons historic resource at about 0.3% copper. And, after we took over management of the company in January, we started to get a bunch of inbounds from, different groups that were curious what we were going to do with it and if it was available for sale or option. And so, I asked Blaine Smith, our VP Exploration, hey, can you, start putting some materials together to see what we have here? We can put a data room together and see if we'll run a process or not. And so the historic resource, first of all, and if you use, CapIQ or one of these different softwares or Google it, you can see it's not 100 million tons. The historic resource, which was done quite a ways ago, a long time ago, was done in 1980. So it was done before National Instrument 43101. So you can't rely on it here. But it was 577 million tons at about 0.72% copper equivalent, primarily copper and gold. There's also silver and molybdenum as well. And it is in Washington State. And it's, I don't know, have you ever been to Mount St. Helens in your travels?
Yeah,
Have you ever gone there? It's
yeah.
pretty cool. So
Yeah.
it's to the north. It's located to the north of the volcano and north of where, the blast came down and knocked down all the trees and caused all that devastation. And so the eruption actually halted work. All the drilling was done by Duval Mining. They drilled 104 holes and came to come up with that historic resource. And then, there's no work until, another iteration of Ascot in 2010 came out and drilled 10 drill holes. Every hole ended in mineralization, and it doubled the down dip extent from that historic resource. So this is a very special deposit. This has the potential to be a tier 1 copper gold porphyry deposit. The mineralization starts right at surface. This is, to quote a American geologist that might be joining our team, that this deposit has pretty well gone unnoticed by the U.S. mining industry 40 years, because this is a very substantial resource of copper. The other big and very interesting revelation is that we have a partner in the project, and that is the federal government of the United States. The BLM owns 50% of patented mineral claims. Cambria has the option to go to a 100% ownership upon the commencement of production. And so, what do you do when the government's your partner? Well, it's like any partner, you reach out. And so I sent an email to the president, has a critical minerals, kind of czar, we've been calling him,
Sure.
leader named David Copley, is an ex-Newmont executive. And so sent him, an email. Hey, we're partners here. What do you want to do with it in terms of advancing it? And, he requested a meeting. We had a meeting with him, no joke, at the White House, and
Good stuff.
started to plan a course of action to how to responsibly advance this project. And so, what U.S. wants a domestic mining industry, particularly for critical metals. And so it's our intent that we will spin this deposit out into a U.S. domiciled and eventually U.S. listed company. And as a standalone, put in a new management team and capitalize it. So, and Cambria will be by far the largest shareholder.
And so that could potentially benefit shareholders of Cambria then.
Yes, correct. Yeah. And so, if you ask the average mining executive on Bay Street or internationally, if you could pick one class of mineral deposit, what would you go for? It's copper, gold, porphyry. And so these type of deposits, like I think the last one, this scale would have been at least over 40 years ago in the United States that would have been built. I don't know for sure, but most of the easy ones have been discovered. So this has the potential to add very, very significant value to Cambria Gold shareholders. Like, up until our announcement last week, the company was getting a zero valuation on this very special deposit.
Hey, excellent. And so, the geologist in you probably can't help but have a look at this thing from a technical standpoint and from some of that historic work that's been done. What do you think? What would sort of be the next step with that once it gets funded and you look to restart some exploration type work? Are you looking to really kind of upgrade that resource into a modern one? Are you looking to sort of fill potential gaps in the historic resource? Do you think there's much exploration upside?
So the 2010 drilling and all the cores on site, it had really good QA/QC. So we are confident, and we'll have discussions with independent QPs to potentially put together an initial 43-101 compliant resource. The drilling is quite widely spaced. It's 100 meters plus, but the continuity of the mineralization within hole and from hole to hole is very good. So, I do believe that this has the potential to have an inferred resource. Since most of the mineralization that we've seen, the drill holes that were completed to date ended in it, we would want to see, how far down this goes. Like most of the drilling's down to only about 500 meters depth. It is open along strike, and then you need to test for continuity, and you want to see if there's a high grade core, which these systems typically would. The geologist in me also knows the history of these type of deposits. In the 1970s, there was some groundbreaking research by Lowell and David Lowell and his partner Gilbert, forget his first name. They had some very groundbreaking papers in terms of how to explore these. And part of the philosophy at the time was that you would drill what's called the phyllic zone, which is kind of a layer, if you think of it, an onion like shaped deposit, that you avoid the potassic core. And that's the case in this deposit, where even the core of the deposit hasn't been adequately tested. And so, there's a lot of geological upside, but based on the footprint that we've seen over a square kilometer of outcropping mineralization, is that we're quite positive that this is an economic project. So you would want to advance this. The U.S. government, I think it's 60% of America's copper consumption is imported. I don't think there's any more important critical metal. Is that to see a project developed, and of course done right, but expeditiously. So we would look for a infill drilling program to show the continuity and do the appropriate field studies to see if and get a feasibility study completed.
Excellent. Well, I'm super bullish on projects based in the United States. So I was very pleasantly surprised to kind of read about it, read about the size and scope of it. And then also had read about the sort of federal government being a partner on those patented claims. So thanks for filling in some information there. So would imagine that this is going to be quite a process. So you're fairly early in the process, so you would know how it would list, percentage Cambria would continue to sort of like hold. Those are all details that you sort of figure out over the next couple of months. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. We're working with the federal government and various entities regarding their ownership position, and we've proposed plans to move forward. We would consult with investors and bankers in terms of evaluation for this type of asset, and then would look to spin it out. But we do want to move very quickly on it. And so, there's a few different potential paths that we would look to to follow. So the company should reach decisions in the next few weeks on that, and we'll issue news accordingly in what our path will be.
Excellent. Thanks for covering that. That's a really interesting aspect that we'll have to pay some close attention to. The pony's got a new trick, so good stuff. So let's just go back a little bit. Last time we chatted with you was back in January, where you were just on the sort of close to financing, or just in the process of kind of finishing the closing of a financing. I think you raised about $175 million in a private placement that I think you guys were having to sort of hustle and market over Christmas. Good on you. Nice to see you got a phenomenal placement sort of closed. In addition, you'd also had a rights offering that you'd done just before that. So I think in total, you raised around $190 million to help recapitalize this company as you were inserting yourself and back taking the helm of this company again. So maybe you could explain a bit about, who would sort of take down that financing. Were there some institutions, any strategic shareholders? Was it largely done with retail shareholders? Maybe you could kind of cover off whatever you're allowed to say about who sort of participated in that.
It was a phenomenal list of investors that came in, both in the first and second tranche, and participated in the rights offering. The largest shareholder, they are a family-owned private mining company that's based in Peru. They operate a very large underground gold mine there. It's called Poderosa. I think in 2024 produced over 300,000 ounces and is scalable. So they were the lead order in the financing, and they continue to own 36% of the company. And then primarily the other investors really was a who's who list of institutional funds that are Canadian, U.S., overseas. Our second largest shareholder is the largest manager of mining money, I believe, in the United States, which is Franklin Templeton. And then a really great list, old friends like Delbrook Capital, Prime Vest based out of Vancouver, Ruffer based out of London. Wonderful funds that came in. Additionally, within the Fiore group, we are backed by Frank Justra, who wrote some sizable checks as well too, and is very supportive. And he likes big things. He wants to build big companies. And so we're very grateful for his guidance, and really thankful to Canaccord Capital and Raymond James and Desjardins, who helped facilitate that large capital raise. But it's a very good shareholder list. They're all along. Like our first tranche of the financing comes free trading on May 1st. Second one is near the end of May. And, we've been holding up quite well despite both the shares and the warrants well in the money from that January close. And so, but we still think, and you probably hear this from every CEO, is that we are still tremendously undervalued given the quality of the gold assets, the stage they're at, all of the infrastructure that's there, and the grades, even the exploration upside.
Sure.
So we've got a long way to run. And, I'm cognizant, hey, the company was weeks away from bankruptcy. This is a show me story. And so we're very, very confident that we're going to show the mining industry and the investment community that these are phenomenal projects if they're sequenced right and done right.
And weeks away from bankruptcy was a little bit of the strategy of, I think this was a company that obviously you knew you had already, and that's where sort of came from you. So you obviously were keeping close tabs on them and probably thought, this might be something that'd be pretty interesting if they need some help because of your expertise in the region and whatnot. So, anyways, you mentioned that you've got some infrastructure. We shouldn't fast forward over that because I think the infrastructure is pretty amazing. Maybe you could just give us a bit of a list of like what you've got, like this premier gold project, which is within the company. It was in production. No, they did some interesting things and skipped a few steps. I think those are the things that you're having to do. But let's talk about what infrastructure is there.
Yeah, there's a brand new mill, and it's permitted for 2,500 tons per day, but you would be able to put 3,000 tons per day through that mill quite easily. There's a tailings management facility where there's recent tailings lifts. There's water treatment plant. There's over 6 kilometers of recently constructed underground workings at 2 of the deposits by the mill. The Premier deposit, where we're currently underground drilling, and a few kilometers to the north, the Big Missouri deposit, which we are in the process of reevaluating more as an underground and surface bulk mineable deposit. This type of mill needs to be filled. Like you can't half fill this type of SAG mill. You have to fill it with ore. And so between that high grade deposit plus the bulk mineable, we're very confident that we might have enough ore here for a early restart. But there's $430 million in tax losses. There's, a lot of the stuff up there admittedly was leased. So with use of proceeds from the financing, we've been buying out a lot of those leases so we can own more things up there. We are going to be taking order of underground mining fleet in the near future. Then if you go over to the other project, Red Mountain, the key thing that's required there is to build a road. We're on the phone with our friends with the provincial and federal government daily to get our permits to start that road construction. We are confident that it should be coming soon to rebuild the existing roadbed to the base of Red Mountain. At Red Mountain itself, there's 2 kilometers of underground working, and it doesn't need any more drilling for 5 years. It's all in the measured resource category. It's been scissor drilled. It's been underground bulk sampled. So a substantial amount of infrastructure that's there already. It's older, but there's even an old mining fleet up there. And hey, it's the intellectual capital. We have a tremendous team, admittedly led by myself, that has tons of northern experience up there. And I'm a student of mining history. I know how they mined successfully in the past and also how they failed. And taking those lessons is what we're incorporating into our execution plan with Cambria.
And so if you were to like try to go and rebuild some of that stuff now, like so you acquired this thing, you acquired it just before it was going to go into bankruptcy, you've recapitalized it, restructured it, got it on a better path. The stock has been on fire. You're from 50 cents to $2 in the last few months, in the last like four plus months. So you're on fire in terms of that and getting the community sort of investment community bought back in on the strategy. If you were to go and like just go and construct the mill, could you hazard a guess of what that would cost to do it today, just on sort of equipment kind of alone?
From 2021 till 2025, I believe it 530 plus million was spent. And so that's everything. That's the mill, that's all the earthworks, that's the underground development. Mining inflation is real. And additionally, the previous management team capitalized on infrastructure that was already there. Like, for example, there was a tailings facility, there was a mill building, and a few
Mhm.
old components in it. But I would guess that this is approaching $1 billion in total, what you would call sunk capital if you're running the economics. And that will be taken into consideration, obviously, is sunk when we update the feasibility study for the combined projects at the end of this year. And that should be one of the biggest catalysts for news for our investors throughout the whole year to show what we expect will be quite robust numbers.
Excellent. So just before we kind of jump into Catalyst, let's just reiterate again just what you've got, because you've got quite a lot to talk about. It's not just a one single sort of project story. Up near Stewart, you've got the Premier Mine, which has a mill, and then it sounds like it's got two sort of deposits, or maybe it's got more. Maybe you could kind of go over
That's right.
what does Premier have?
So Premier has three deposits in total. All three were historic producers. Premier Mine was the richest in North America for about 15 years. Very, very high grade underground producer. Narrower veins, like in the 3 to 4 meter type range. And so substantial high grade resources there. It wasn't drilled enough. And so we are currently doing infill drilling on it to do the appropriate definition drilling for stope design. The Big Missouri deposit was bulk mined by Cominco in the 1940s. It was in around 3 grams per ton in the first year, and I think it was 2.5 or a bit in the second year. That has significant underground workings and a lot of drilling. We need to do a little bit of drilling, not a lot, to be prepared to go in there and mine. Additionally, we've identified these three areas to potentially open pit. And then the third area is called Silvercoin. It used to be in a company called Tenajon that my uncle Don McLeod and my cousin Bruce McLeod mined back in the 90s. Bulk mining as well too, long hole stoping. And so between the three, we have a lot of ore to fill that mill. And so we're just internally like running some numbers to gauge, hey, 4,700 or whatever it's trading at today, dollar gold is very, very favorable. So there might be enough accessible that we can restart early while we continue to develop access and ultimately start producing and trucking ore from the Red Mountain deposit, which will be really the big revenue driver because it's so high grade and bulk mineable.
Excellent. And you've also, and maybe you could just talk about like so in terms of Premier, you're going to be doing a new feasibility study. Is that correct?
We are going to be updating a feasibility study for all of the deposits utilizing the single mill. And so there was a feasibility study that was published in 2021. And so it'll actually be an update to that. However, we will be incorporating the infill drilling program that we're doing, revised designs, revised throughputs, and it should be the biggest catalyst of the year. Not a lot of field studies are required for this. One change that we are considering is actually putting in an aerial tram line, which had been contemplated on and off over the years, that would help deal with the world record snowfalls that you can get up in the Golden Triangle. Like, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's a big operational challenge. We have some estimates in from, the same time wherever you go skiing here, it's the same company, Doppelmayr, and in fact, ski lifts came from the aerial tramline industry post World War II. So it's kind of coming full circle, but the additional capital required for that would go into the feasibility study. And, from our internal numbers, we do believe it would be cost accretive due to operating efficiencies utilizing that technology.
All right. Excellent. Good stuff. So in March and in April, you put out some infill results, some infill drilling results. And when you talk about like high grade, high grade is not necessarily high grade. It depends, some people will classify, 2 grams gold high grade. You guys have some pretty eye-popping sort of numbers in terms of this. Would you mind just sort of like going over like when you say high grade, what does that like really mean in terms of why don't you explain some of the infill results that you recently disclosed?
Sure. And, keep in mind, it's just, our first half dozen or so holes from an area of the premier mine. But just a bit of historical context, this type of mineral deposit has chutes in it. So you have, a structural corridor, and then within it, you have areas that the high grade is concentrated. So historically, in the old mine, and you want to follow the really good science that the old timers did, there were 9 of these chutes, and they had a very, very good down plunge continuity. So as part of the infill drilling, we are focusing on those chutes. So this first bit of drilling was from the west side of the deposit. It's called the 602 zone, and you go right into the middle of the chute, and that's the high grade that you're looking for. So we hit about 18 grams over 22 meters at very close to true widths there, and then some other good grade around it. And so you line that up with some of the historic holes, and you project it up to the old workings, and we do believe we're in one of those chutes there. And so currently, we started our infill drilling program actually with a surface rig. We currently have 2 drills that are working underground on the opposite side of the deposit. It's called the Prue zone, and we're banging off several holes there sometimes per day to appropriately delineate. It's really they're flashy, they're fun. Investors like them, but they're still infill, and so they're not as exciting as putting in a new
Sure.
discovery. But it does show, why some of the grades that made this, as I say, the richest mine in North America for 15 years. And so it really does have the capacity to produce some good grades.
Excellent. And so then you contrast that with what's your exploration season going to look like this sort of spring summer?
Well, the great thing about underground drilling is that you are really not subject to seasonality, and so I imagine, we'll be continuously underground drilling and infill and some exploration all throughout the year. But from surface, because there are some areas that the underground workings won't get, you can. We're drilling in the winter, but primarily we will be starting up probably in later on in May and drilling on until October using both skid and helicopter supported drills. It is pretty steep mountains around there, as you know. And so you still have to use helicopters to access certain areas. So we will be doing infill drilling as well at the Big Missouri deposit, particularly in these areas that we are contemplating for some of the small pits. And as well as, there's some big, broad, potentially bulk mineable intervals at the Silver Coin deposit that are close to surface and close. Actually, some are close to the underground workings that my cousin Bruce used to mine at. And just so we can factor those areas early into a potential restart. And they're best, given the geometry of the mineralized zones, they are better drilled from. So, we should have those surface drill results, later on in the fall and throughout the summer.
How many drills in total do you think you'll be using across the various deposits and at various times this year?
Probably up to 4. The drilling here is really good. You get good production. We have a new team that is mastering the geology. They're very, very talented. And, there's been thousands of drill holes that have been completed previously. The key is to interpret them properly. And so if you have really good scientists that are a valid interpretive model that is based on that science, you often don't need to do as much infill drilling as one might think. So 4 drills is great. We have a phase 1 approval for 27,000 meters, but my guess is that we'll be having a phase 2 drilling program announced later on in the summer that would continue on with that.
So we might see a few other news releases with some drilling results.
Yeah, and I will have a bunch all summer, and hopefully there's some bangers. There'll probably be some dusters too. That's drill.
That's the way it goes. Well, there you go. I thank you for making sure people realize that it's not just always bangers all the time.
Yeah,
That's natural in this sort of in this thing. Now you'd mentioned Red Mountain. Now, Red Mountain, you're also going to be pulling that into the feasibility using a centralized mill. Is that the
that's correct. And Red Mountain was in the previous feasibility study, but at the end of the mine life. It is unquestionably the best deposit in the portfolio. The average thickness for the whole ore body is 15 meters. It's up to 100 meters wide in places. And the average measured grade is a little under 9 grams per ton. First, proposed 2 years of mining would be an average thickness of 25 meters with a resource grade of 10.5. And so you pull those grades and tons up to the front end of the mine life, and they provide the majority of the tons, and you blend it in from a smaller component, like maybe a quarter of the tons might come from Premier, and you have a very nice, significant gold producer. And that's our goal. And that's why, I maintain that publishing that feasibility study will be one of the biggest catalysts of the year.
All right. And that's going to be towards the end of the year?
Correct. Yeah. So we're looking at fourth quarter. So we're close to awarding who the engineering firm that will be to
Get the job?
publish the
Yep.
get the job done for us. And additionally, it's all guided by, we have just an exceptional engineering and construction team that we've assembled, led by my partner, Ryan Waymark, with his Fuse Advisory, has, just as consultants, he's the founder of it, has 50 mining engineers. So we have a ton of technical depth when needed. But our own internal team, led by Gord Dirksen, who's our VP of projects, and our construction manager, Nick Stoneberger, who's worked all over the place, but a lot in the north, seen a lot of snow in his life too, is that we've got the team that's going to execute here.
And okay, let's sort of switch gears a little bit. Cap structure valuation. What's the market cap today of the company approximately?
So we're a little over 600 million, pretty close to $1 billion fully diluted.
Of shares. Okay. So just
$1 billion.
Oh, okay. Sorry. That's right. $1 billion. And then in terms of your shares, I guess based upon that, you've got what, just under 370 million shares out?
Yeah, that's correct. As mentioned, that the financing is going to be coming free trading here shortly. The shares were at 60 cents. The warrants are at 85 cents, and if exercised, if all of them are exercised, it'd bring in about 125 million in new money. And so, fully diluted, it's over a little over 600 million shares outstanding. However, there are quite a few, actually tens of millions. I don't have the exact number on the top of my head of warrants that are well out of the money from previous financings by the previous management team. And so still the cap table's quite good. And particularly, with 60% of the shareholders are a combination of Ccori Apu, Fiore, management, such as myself and Ryan Waymark, and then Franklin Templeton. And so, there hasn't been much of a float over the past few months, so there isn't a lot of liquidity in the stock. But it'll be interesting to see what happens over the next month, particularly with this identification of all this value with the Mount Margaret deposit that we think can add a significant value to the company.
Is that something you might consider like spinning out and actually dividending shares to those shareholders that are current shareholders? Or is it
Yeah,
something that
it is a consideration for sure. Where we're at right now is that Cambria would be the by far largest shareholder of the spinout. There's reasons for and against dividending out shares. Often it leads just to selling. You're getting basically a stock at a zero cost base. And so it, can be punitive to the new company. And additionally, it could be, for some shareholders, it could be a taxable event. That said, for the spinout, you do want to have some liquidity, and you do want to reward, our great shareholders that put up their risk capital to back us. And so we still haven't made the decision what that would look like in structure, but there's a possibility that there, could be as much of a quarter of the value gets dividended out to our existing shareholders.
Okay, good stuff. So you've got a financing that sort of comes free. Approximately how much money do you guys have? Right now, I guess whatever your last disclosed sort of figure, maybe like your investor deck or something. What sort of approximate cash and are you guys fully funded for this year, or do you think?
Oh
Do you
yes,
think?
we're definitely we are fully funded. We're a little under 150 million. We had to take care of some payables. We have been ramping up, but we haven't really started the big capital projects, primarily the construction of the Red Mountain Road. We need to redo a lot of the engineering for the water treatment plant. It wasn't in compliance before. There are some aspects of it that need to be redone. And so we've got quite a bit of capital committed to that. And additionally, we just started the infill drilling. We haven't spent a huge amount of money in that. So we're still, the balance sheet still looks very, very good. And the warrants that were part of that financing, they're short term. They're only 1 year. There's no accelerator, but they would expire, first tranche at the end of 2026 and the second tranche at the end of January 2027. And so, that with that capital, then, we if we're not good, we're very, very close to having enough capital to have substantial producer.
Well, that sounds good. Hopefully, you won't be having to do another big financing around Christmas at the end of the year, but we shall see.
I'll never forget it, Cure. I was working the
Yeah,
phones on Christmas Eve. And so,
yeah, yeah. I bet.
like we're really pleased how it all came together, but there was times where it was a struggle. A lot of people lost a lot of money on Ascot. And
Right.
yeah, and we got those lead orders in. We started building some momentum. We had real hustle from our bankers as well as ourselves, and we ended up with a very, very good registry. So it all worked out, but there was some late nights and in early mornings hustling. So, but that's what it takes. I'm inspired by the old timers. And our crew up there. Hey, they're out of the camp in Stewart by 4:30 a.m. to head up the hill, and so you want to work as hard as them.
There you go. Well, so just to take, we've talked about a lot. We've jumped around a little bit. There's lots of good complexity with what you have going on. But to simplify this, this is kind of this is an advanced sort of development stage story. Was in production under some previous management. You're now taking the time to sort of redo the engineering, look at how you can do this in a more robust, better margin sort of way. And you've got most of the heavy equipment and equipment that you need for the mine already sort of in place. So this is really kind of an advanced sort of mid-tier multi-asset sort of development company producer.
Yeah, it's hey, we look to some of our neighbors for inspiration in terms of execution and in terms of, how they've driven value. Artemis, which is the newest gold producer in British Columbia, they defied and did a great job of executing and defying the cliche of the Lassonde curve.
Hmm.
Skeena Resources with their SK deposit. And, they had bumps in the road with, uncertainty related to permitting. And so they also defied the Lassonde curve. So we look to do the same as a, very near term development stage, near production story by, the re-rate that comes from, when you get everything finished and you start producing. Those are two great comparisons as multi-billion dollar companies for what we want to achieve within the next couple of years. And so,
Yeah, Artemis was a tremendous story. I remember Nick Campbell pounding the table on that at like $2 a share, and it had a 15 bagger to go from there.
and I remember Walt Coles with Skeena, was just him and a really small team, really hustling to get believers in. And so it's so thrilling to see, for the investors and for the leaderships in those type of companies. And it's great for all of British Columbia. It's great for the impacted First Nations and Indigenous groups. And so, we're in a great province with an amazing gold mining history. And we look forward to being the next chapter in the production story of BC.
Now, typically when you're talking Lassonde curve, one of the reasons why advanced or sort of like development stories go through this sort of orphaning period is people are really concerned about how dilutive and how they're going to raise their construction capital. With you, you've already got a large portion of all your construction capital already. Somebody else already did it because you've got this brand new mill, SAG mill, 2,500 tons per day, could go up to 3,000. Your problem's really just being, hey, there wasn't enough ore to like fill that thing to make it like work properly. So that's what you guys are tackling with an updated feasibility. But that's something that we should remind people, is that there's not necessarily going to be smacked over the head with big further dilutive sort of financings. There may be additional capital is needed, but you're not having to like go out and raise, $500 million for construction.
Mhm.
You've got a lot of that construction already behind you. Somebody else already spent the 500 million. Is that correct?
Yeah, so that's, and particularly with those, warrants, assuming that they get exercised, and it's looking pretty good that that can be the case, is that, and then finally, with this additional value that could come out of the Mount Margaret deposit, which, gives the optionality for further funding if required. And then finally, there isn't much of a debt burden on this company. And so, there are non-dilutive options out there if the company needs additional money. And I'm pretty optimistic that we should get things done with the cash we have and the incoming cash. It's mining, so it's never any guarantees.
There you go. Well, any sort of final thoughts that you want to leave people with that maybe are new to the story, or maybe sort of knew it under its previous sort of name? What sort of final thoughts would you like to leave us with?
Well, just that investors are in this to make money, and you want to look for stories that you can minimize the downside risk, but you still have tons of upside. And Cambria has that. We have a floor based on the ounces in the ground and all the infrastructure that's in place, and the ceiling is way up there. So, our door is always open for any sort of investor inquiries. Follow our social media channels for more information on these really exciting projects. And stay tuned for a lot of catalysts in the next couple of months.
Excellent. Well, Rob, I really appreciate your time, as you know, and you processed my sub agreement. You let me come in. I really do appreciate being a shareholder of the company. Excited to see sort of what you make of it, and really excited to sort of read the updated feasibility when that's out at the end of the year. I think you've got an exceptional group of talent that you've assembled, world class team, and then you've got such an interesting strategic asset in the Golden Triangle during a time when we've got elevated metal prices. So it's one of those things where you have to. For me, I'm like, I got to be a shareholder of this, and so far it's working out well. We'll see how things go, but got a
We're
lot of
glad
trust
that
in what
you're
you.
in for the long haul. You're just throw that cert in the drawer here.
Yeah, of course. Well, I'm hoping I just can exercise my warrants and like that I'm in the money and send you some more money. I love that. There's been
We would absolutely love that.
quite a few financings here because we've been in a metals boom. It's been finally able to get those warrants exercised and own further shares of things that are not upside down. So it's nice when that sort of works. So, anyways, it's great update. Thanks very much for spending some time with us, and look forward to catching up maybe towards the end of the summer after you've got some exploration updates out.
Yeah, looking forward to it, Kier. Thanks so much.
Thank you.